Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call to order the regular Planning Commission meeting, City of Campbell, July the 12th, 2022. Mr. Clerk, could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Rowland.
Present.
Commissioner Scissor. Here. Commissioner Ostrowski.
Present.
Commissioner Craig. Here. Commissioner Kempcott. Absent. Commissioner Vice Chair Buckbinder.
Present.
Chair Ching.
Present. Thank you. So moving on, first item, approval of the minutes. Has everybody had a chance to review the minutes from the last meeting? Any corrections, errors? Yeah.
I guess maybe this got started. Maybe the week that I wasn't there and didn't see the minutes, but I noticed how the change has been to simplify the commissioner's comments and questions. And I just found that in the latest minutes, it's like there's like one sentence.
Yeah, these are.
It doesn't even mention what the commissioners really discussed.
As I understand, these are action minutes, right?
That's correct. I think that they've moved for action minutes now.
With the video being the record.
Right.
Yeah.
So I didn't know whether or not other commissioners were concerned about the fact that there's no reference to what we either asked questions about or discussed, even in summary.
I don't believe we had a discussion on it. I guess the full.
I wanted to bring it up before we approve the minutes.
I guess this is something for maybe for the staff, but we've got a video and voice recording of this if we wanted to go back, I suppose.
If I could add, I mean, this was a deliberate decision of the director just for expediency. I mean, we have pretty good video recordings now on YouTube and on the city's website. And if for some reason any action resulting in litigation, the city can always pay for a video to be fully transcribed. So we're just moving forward in kind of a new understanding of what minutes really are intended to do, which is simply to capture the action of the commission. And this has been the council's practice for many, many, many years.
This is in terms of written, it's new.
It is new.
Right?
Correct.
Okay, and I'm not, so we're just saying it's not necessary in the written record to go into detail.
Correct. So the director did indicate a few meetings ago that we would be transitioning to action minutes.
I guess I wasn't clear on what that meant.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
The purpose is then for, in case there was any litigation, to go back and review. It seems like the purpose is not to allow the public to investigate the discussion. Is that correct?
No, the public can certainly view the video. Public can certainly view the video and watch the meetings entirely online on YouTube. So we have a lot more public access than in the past.
Yes, but then you have to sit through everything rather than just searching or skimming the transcript.
Correct. It is a little more challenging in that regard.
I guess it's a trade-off, isn't it? There's somebody's time taking the minutes verbatim or just recording the actions.
I just to further I did look on like I went to the Santa Clara County Planning Commission to look and see what their minutes look like. And they are simpler. They don't call out the comments from each of the commissioners specifically, but at least they summarize what the comments were in terms of they discussed this and this and this and this. Okay, so there was a little bit more than just the commissioners discussed and generally approved. I mean, that's basically what we're seeing in the minutes, just generally agreed. So I'm just wondering if we can revisit that a little bit, or consider revisiting it a little bit to at least have more of a summarization of what commissioners have brought up.
I mean, some of this also reflects a change in our staffing model. we no longer have an executive assistant. So when Kareem retired, we rethought that position, and we have a part-time admin that provides some support, but we simply do not have a 40-hour-a-week individual who does the type of work that we would have seen in the past with those minutes, which were very time-consuming.
Just,
I mean, I understand constraints on resources, but I don't think that should keep us from doing whatever the right thing is. I mean, I understand you guys are resource constrained, but I don't think you change procedures because you don't have an administrative person, full time. I just principle wise, that seems like not a way to deal with things, but I just want to have it noted. And the only other thing I had was that you guys spelled my name wrong. I'm in the past minutes, by the way, in all the motions, it's misspelled, so I'd like that to be duly corrected.
I'll certainly fix that.
All right.
just if this helps a bit, the notes I have say that it was April 26th where the change was announced, that we were switching to action minutes. So it's been since then.
Well, I didn't go back. So you're saying in May? I mean, I missed the June meeting, but it seems to me that before, it's only been activated in the last two meetings, but I might be wrong about that.
I'm pretty sure this is the second time that we've had the truncated minutes, but
Yeah.
your observation, this is a 180-degree change in the types of minutes. And I know, I guess I asked somebody offline about it, and I think the fact that we have the video record kind of covers it, but it was interesting and did catch my eye, and it was something I kind of wanted to. We have the video record in case there's ever a need for that. So I guess I thought that it was okay, but I wasn't sure until this minutes that was going to be our system. Although I do know the director did mention it. So if the plurality of the commission wants to have slightly beefed up minutes with a little more, items recorded, maybe there is a happy, medium there.
Well, I think it's noted, and we can ask the community development director when he's back. I don't know what I would find on most business meetings. Nobody takes minutes anymore. It's recorded, and we recently had some a meeting transcribed automatically. I think it's even in the Zoom software now. You can pay for the option. It's
understand
balancing
that.
costs, right?
Yeah, sure.
Where do you want to spend your money? But noted, and you can put it in there for the record.
We just don't know if this discussion is pretty good in the minutes.
It's recorded.
Recorded.
Yeah. Okay. So, cool, a long evening. Do I hear approval for the new shortened minutes?
I'd like to move to approve the
Thank you very
shortened
much.
minutes, please.
A second?
Second.
Thank you. We have those like whatever it
These are
is.
for total, these are for the May 24th and June 14th, it looks like meeting. Commissioner Wolfman?
Aye.
Commissioner Scissor?
Aye.
Commissioner Ostrowski?
Aye.
Commissioner Pruitt? Aye. Commissioner Kemko? Vice Chair Bookbinder?
Aye.
Chair Ching?
Aye. So thank you. So moving on to communications, agenda modifications or postponement. Acting Development Director, Farmer. Oh, sorry, in fact, Famer, sorry. I didn't say that.
No, we do not have any communications or postponements or modifications.
Thank you very much. So this is part of the meeting where we go on to the oral requests. This is the point on the agenda where members of the public may address the Commission on items of concern to the community that are not listed on the agenda this evening. People may speak up to 5 minutes on any matter concerning the Commission. Don't see anybody in the audience, nobody online, so I'll close that part. And move on to the first and only agenda item this evening. Not sure if it's relevant, but I will ask my fellow commissioners any disclosures regarding the first item and only item. Okay. So we have one public hearing tonight, city initiated, public hearing to consider a city initiated zoning code text amendment PLN 2021 187, adding new chapter 21.25, 2-unit housing developments, and chapter 20.14, urban lot splits to the Campbell Municipal Code to implement Senate Bill number 9, brackets SB9, and amending various other sections of the Municipal Code pertaining to the regulation of accessory dwelling units, brackets ADUs, an amendment to the Campbell Village Neighbourhood Plan, and a general plan amendment to the San Thomas Area Neighbourhood Plan to incorporate by reference proposed SB9 implementation provisions. Staff is recommending that this item be deemed statutorily exempt under SECRA. Tentative City Council meeting date, August the 2nd, 2022. Project Planner Daniel.
Thank you. This is the Planning Commission's second review of the draft SB9 ordinance and the 2 associated amendments to the Campbell Village Neighborhood Plan and the Santa Monica Area Neighborhood Plan. As noted in your staff report, days after the Planning Commission's first review of the draft ordinance, the state HCD, that's the Housing Community Development Department, released what they call their SB9 fact sheet, providing guidance to local cities on how to implement the law. The city's ordinance was very consistent with that guidance, with one major exception. HCD's reading of SB9 indicates that the provisions of the law apply to just a single unit as opposed to 2, which was the common understanding from most cities in the general public. It was often referred to as a duplex bill, and there's some terminology that supports that, but that is the approach that they've taken. We then did need to update our draft ordinance, which is a pretty substantial change before we can go back to the City Council. However, we also took this as an opportunity to further refine some of the changes as it pertains to our current ADU ordinance. We did look at the state's ADU handbook, which was released about a year after the city adopted our ADU ordinance, and realized that we were out of compliance in several key areas. So we did provide some additional revisions to those that chapter as well. And that's all contained in the draft ordinance, now highlighted in yellow. So anything not, that's the wrong file, apologies. Anything not indicated in yellow highlight in your packet, it remains the same as from your previous meeting. So with regard to the SB9 revisions, the new draft ordinance would still require that applicants at least plan for 2 units so that staff can understand kind of the comprehensive picture of the proposed SB9 project, but they would not be compelled to actually build both units. So you could show us how you can make both units work, but if you only want to build one, that's perfectly fine. You won't be in violation of the city's code. And then if you want to build a second unit in the future, that's perfectly okay. You can come back with a new application and build that second unit. With regard to the updated ADU provisions, the state has a concept of a statewide exemption ADU, basically any ADU that's 800 square feet or less and no taller than 16 feet, pretty much exempt from all local standards. So we did clarify the extent of that, particularly with regard to open space design and building separation requirements. We also noticed that we were lacking a JADU owner occupancy requirement that compels an owner to either reside within the JADU or the primary home. We also updated the number of allowable bedrooms, upping that from 2 to 3. The ACD is of the opinion that any number is a bit too restrictive. Staff does disagree with that as a bit of an interpretation of the law. We feel that 3 is appropriate and generally consistent with a 1,200 square foot unit. 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, kitchen, and a living room is pretty much as you can functionally fit within 1,200 square feet. Then just some minor changes to allowing some expansion to multifamily residential ADUs And then also clarifying that public improvements such as construction of a sidewalk, curb and gutter will not be triggered by construction of the ADU in any circumstance. So with that, staff does recommend that the Planning Commission adopt a resolution recommending that the City Council adopt the draft SB 9 ordinance and the associated amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. There was a great summary in your document, by the way. It made it very clear to me. So any questions? Start with Commissioner Cray.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel, for this. And I know we've been through this obviously quite a few times. Just trying to understand a couple of things. And I know we say approximately 1,000 single-family parcels in Campbell are of sufficient size to add a secondary dwelling unit. And I know that apparently we have 6,800 R1 zoned lots.
I'm sorry, is that number coming from some of our materials?
Yeah, I'm looking right here at program H5.3A, secondary dwelling units.
From the housing element.
I'm not sure what page 2 of the report
Oh,
of the proposed resolution.
I see. No, I think, yeah.
Does that sound right? Am I reading it wrong or?
No, you're reading correct. You're referring to page 4 of the staff report. That is policy H5.3A.
Yeah.
So when the current housing element was adopted, the city had a minimum 10,000 square foot lot size for ADUs, and that is no longer the case. So back when this was adopted in 2014, that would have been accurate, but that is now out of date.
Oh, okay. So that's not the case now.
Correct. So every single family property and any property actually with a residential designation can have an ADU.
Okay, that makes a big difference. That's why I was kind of curious. So we'll have to take this out of this.
Well, the entire housing element is being replaced with a new housing
Okay.
element. So this language will be replaced by the end of the
So
year.
there's no reason to read this stuff. When we mentioned that the Torah Center said about 700 estimated or guesstimated 700 ADUs for Campbell. And in our staff report, and I can't remember where it was, but it's said the Torah study said that was the case because of the cost is that really the main limiting factor in terms of the estimated number of ADUs?
Yes, the construction cost is certainly a large limiting factor, but from my understanding, another limiting factor has been the owner occupancy requirement. Well, the law's requirement that an owner attests that the intent to live on one of the properties that is subdivided. So that effectively precludes developers from fully exercising SB 9. It almost puts homeowners in the position of having to be developers.
Okay. And just one final question in a different area, and I think you just answered it in your report just now. What brought my eye was section 22 again. I can't navigate the report easily, but detached ADUs larger than 800 square feet, if not entirely behind primary residence, shall match the appearance, blah, blah, blah. And I was wondering why it's only larger than 800 square feet. And I think what you just said in your report, and I'm asking you if that's correct, is that anything under 800 square feet, there's no standards because that's,
Exactly.
Okay, that's what you said. Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. Commissioner Kimco.
Thank you, Chair. So you said they don't have to build both units at the same time. They can build one and then later on. Is later on like 5 years from the first one? Can they build the second one 5 years from the first one, or does it have to be within a year?
So within the approval that would be granted, the SB 9 zoning clearance approval, they would have 12 months after the first one has been issued a building permit. So that could be extended by an additional year.
Okay, but what about the second unit?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So it's as proposed, there's basically 2 phases. So within the first year, you have to at least obtain a building permit for the first unit. And then after you do that, you have 1 additional year to obtain a building permit for the second unit. And in either of those, you could request a 1-year extension.
Okay, and let's say your finances would not allow you to build the second one. What happens?
If the permit approval expires out, then you would just need to apply again when you do have the financing.
Okay, thank you. Second question was regarding, what about just regular lot splits? You just want to split the lot. You don't want to build anything right now. You just want to split it and either sell the splitted lot or build, let's say, sometimes in the future, not 1 year, but how does that work?
So our draft SB 9 ordinance actually ties the urban lot splits to the SB 9 zoning clearance. So if you want to do an urban lot split, you need to submit an application for the new homes on both lots concurrently so that we can look at the entire proposal comprehensively as a single project.
But they don't have to be built. You
Correct.
just have to be shown.
Correct. So you could subdivide the project and then you could sell off that lot with approved plans to somebody else. And then they could build those homes,
Got it.
or they can say, no, I have a better idea. And then they can submit their own application. Either way, you've still been able to successfully divide the lot.
Excellent. And then the last question was regarding, you mentioned the building spacing and everything has to be worked out. How about the number of stories in a building? You know, is that, you know, how does that work with the SB 9?
All the base standards continue to apply. So the city generally limits single-family homes to 2.5 stories. The half story is functionally a third story within the attic area. And so that would generally apply in most cases. Now, there is an exception process that as a last resort, when we've given standards away in terms of setbacks, separation, floor area ratio, open space, lot coverage, and there's just no way you can get it to work. Theoretically, you could seek an ability to have a full third story. That seems unlikely, but that's theoretically possible.
Basement doesn't count as one of the stories, right? So if a
Correct.
building wants to have a basement, then it would theoretically have 3 levels, 1 being underground, 2 being.
Exactly. And the city's obligation to allow exceedance of certain standards is only to the extent necessary to allow a housing unit up to 800 square feet. So that's, given the lots in Campbell, we don't anticipate anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
I have a question. So can you clarify the subdivision and the deed restriction element? Because I recall when we discussed this previously, we concluded we did not want to have deed restrictions.
Let's pull that up.
So this is the intent to occupy. So SB 9, so the state law itself does require that a homeowner indicate that they intend to occupy one of the lots. What most cities have been doing, and this is guidance we've also received from ABAG, is to require a document affidavit that will be recorded on the property that simply indicates that that subdivider intends to occupy, lot 1 or lot 2. Now, to what extent that's enforceable, I think it's still up in the air. And the city does not have any intention to actually pursue enforcement, in large part because it's not necessarily structured as a restriction. It's more of a promise.
So it's not a deed restriction?
Not in the sense that we use that term for owner occupancy requirements for like ADUs. With ADUs, if you violate it, it's very clear, and then it would also constitute a violation of the city's zoning code.
Can I weigh in on this? The only interesting thing I'm thinking of here is it's phrased within the language as a deed restriction. And on multiple occasions, we've sat here and worked with staff, appreciate the back and forth with staff. You know, in the staff's comments, we can't understand the feeling of the room in 1986. Now, we'll have this video and we'll have action minutes, but not that someone's going to go back. All right, the YouTube archive will be unavailable for some reason. But, you know, maybe in 30 years, and there is a change in, I don't know, city staff, obviously there'll be a change in city staff, but, you know, that was a deed and you didn't manage that. So I wonder if it comes with some kind of subnote or I don't know how you would do that in the code.
I mean, I would point out that the affidavit, the intent to occupy really is only a period of 3 years. So 30 years, we're all past the point where it's an issue.
Good flag. Thank you.
But I think, regardless, it's a discrepancy between what we had discussed and aligned on in the past.
I mean, I don't recall any direction from the commission on that point. But again, there is a pretty big distinction between what's up here under it and the intent to occupy in the term deed restriction as applies to ADUs and JADUs. The deed restriction for ADUs and JADUs is recorded on the title as a means to inform prospective buyers of the property of the encumbrance that is on that parcel. It's still enforceable just by virtue of the fact that it's within the city zoning code that you can't, for instance, Airbnb your ADU. And then now, as we're indicating, we're proposing if you have a JADU, you have to live on the property. That's a different issue, very substantively compared to the intent to occupy. Here, the subdivider simply has to say that they intend to occupy. Believe me, this has been very confusing for all planning departments up and down California. That concept doesn't really make a lot of sense to us professionally, but that's what the law is saying. That's all they need to say is that they intend to occupy.
Okay. Can I think Alan's got a question first? Do you want to ask? Alan, you were going to ask a question, I believe.
Yeah. Are you good? Okay, so I just wanted, I guess I think it might have been answered, but I just wanted, because I'd taken this note when I read through about the requirement for plan for 2 units. That requirement is only if they're submitting for a lot split as part of their
No,
application.
it applies to any SB 9 proposal. So if you were proposing a lot split, creating 2 lots from 1 lot, you would need to show us 2 homes on each new lot for a total of 4 homes.
Okay, so what is the SBI requirement that isn't a lot split?
You can develop an existing lot without splitting it. So if you have an existing house, you could build another house. You could demolish the existing house and build 2 new homes, or you can build a duplex.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if requiring somebody to plan for something that they may or may not need to do, is that really onerous on the property owner, unreasonably onerous? So I was thinking, well, if you're applying for a lot split, that makes sense, because whether you have a house on the ready, or you're going to demolish that house and then build another one, plus then have a lot split for the second, whatever, then yeah, it seems reasonable to, if they're saying we're going to do a lot split, that you could have 2 plans, but otherwise, I'm not clear as to whether or not this is a reasonable requirement, or whether it plays. I mean, obviously, if you have
Can we reserve this to the discussion, or do you have a particular question you'd like?
Yeah, asking if it might seem onerous to they have to spend more money to do 2 plans.
Yeah.
Well, again, this is where it gets a little confusing from our perspective, because if you want to build 1 house, well, you can already do that using existing zoning requirements. The whole idea, at least as we initially perceived it, was SB 9 was allowing you to build 2 homes instead of 1, getting rid of single family zoning. So if your intent is to build just 1 house, you have a whole zoning code that allows you to do that, plus an ADU, plus a JADU.
But I think what we're hearing is that if you want to split your lot and you want to build a house on one of the lots, or you want to split the lot and allow someone else to build a house on the other part of the property, you're saying in order to split the lot, you have to submit that application along with plans for what you're going to build, but you don't actually have to build it. So yeah, you're going to spend like thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars to get an architect to put together plans that don't require execution.
Now, I would note that the commission already in your previous recommendation did already recommend that. So we have already tied together the zoning clearance proposal for the new construction concurrent with the subdivision for the urban lot split. What we're talking about here is to really just firm up that a homeowner doesn't have to build that second unit. The draft, as previously reviewed by the commission, already did require 2 homes. We're just clarifying that that can be severable, that second unit doesn't have to be built. Now, I would also highlight that with regard to the urban lot split, when we talk about 2 units, as described by SB 9, unit is very expansive. So that unit could actually just be a JADU or an ADU. You don't necessarily have to plan for 2 full-size single-family homes. You could just show us a plan that shows a house with a JADU, and that would suffice.
That you don't have to build. I mean, it seems like a bit of muda.
I'm sorry?
It seems like a bit of, what's the best way? Theater? That would be a good way to explain it. Yeah. So in other words, what's the value of that? What does it provide to the community? What information, the review time, the process, like what is the value of that?
So the challenging part here is that absent discretionary review, particularly with the urban lot splits, normally the Subdivision Map Act that guides subdivision throughout California has 2 phases. You have a tentative map that, as it sounds, is tentative. So it's somewhat preliminary, ensuring us basic feasibility of how your subdivision is going to work. And then if that looks good and meets the city standards, that gets approved by the decision-making body, which can be the director or the commission or the council. And then you do your final map with our public works department, and then that gets recorded. With SB 9, that first phase disappears. There is no tentative map anymore. We go straight to final map.
That's
So
supposed to be objective.
Correct, and it's supposed to be ministerial. So we lose a lot of ability to fully understand some of the ramifications, particularly with regard to utility placement and grading. So by compelling property owners to demonstrate how they're going to build, where they're going to build, we can really deal with the grading issues and utilities before we actually approve a subdivision, because we only get 1 shot at this.
But everything that's proposed doesn't have to be executed.
Correct. So a homeowner could certainly subdivide that property and sell that lot with pre-approved plans for a new house, that then they just get a building, that someone else can get a building permit and build. But if that new buyer doesn't necessarily like that house, they can redesign it. They can submit a new application to do it. But it would need to be connected, at least at the outset.
So what is the situation that this is trying to avoid, as an example?
We're trying to avoid creation of lots that can't be built on, or that create situations that maybe you have utilities that conflict with other utilities, or that have to cross neighboring property lines. We're trying to avoid sticky situations for which we have no tools to address. You have to remember, SB 9 just fell out of the sky. I mean, it violates any number of principles of the whole understanding of single-family zoning, of how we look at these things, and cities have been given virtually no time to address it. And so asking for as much understanding upfront is generally our best practice to deal with this. I mean, it's actually how we deal with most planning applications. I mean, I'm not sure if any of you have ever seen our application checklist, but we ask for a lot for materials that go before you, very extensive level of materials, so we can really see how these projects work out. Because believe it or not, I mean, architects and engineers, they can make mistakes, and they often do all the time. And that's kind of a big part of our job, is to see how those things work with each other, how they interplay. And unfortunately, losing our ability to exercise some discretionary authority, we don't have, again, the tools to necessarily avoid some of the pitfalls as we currently do. So asking for a lot of this information up front, tying the development of the subdivisions at the same time, we're hoping to prevent situations that could be challenging in the future.
I just got,
So, Maggie, any further questions?
I just, you know, just I know we approved this before, right? You're asking for an adjustment. So just in fairness to you, obviously some of us didn't catch it the first time. So, and so now that it's, just this one area, it pops out. So I just wanted to clarify that. I understand that this was already approved, but the plans for the two things were obviously something that at least some of us didn't catch. I have a question about the ADUs. So you obviously don't think that limiting it to, I think it's reasonable to limit it to 3. But since the state doesn't have that stipulation, are you saying that you don't think there's going to be a problem even with limiting it to 3 units in an ADU?
With regard to getting,
3 bedrooms.
3 bedrooms, yeah.
Right.
With regard to running afoul of the HCD?
Yeah.
That certainly could be an issue, but HCD's opinions are just that. They do carry a certain amount of weight. They are allowed to weigh in. In theory, we're allowed just as much weight in our interpretation of the statute. How that ultimately would play out if there were a challenge in court is pretty much anybody's guess at this point in time. But as Daniel has pointed out, the probability of squeezing in more than 3 bedrooms is pretty remote.
Correct. And from a policy standpoint, what we're trying to avoid too, one, ADUs, they are, literally supposed to be accessory to the main house, and they're subordinate. It's in a whole second house. The second is some level of concern that some homeowner, some property owners could try to effectively create a boarding house. There's nothing but a series of bedrooms with 1 bathroom shared amongst everybody. And that would be challenging, honestly, to preclude. It becomes a new use, and we have to get into what that is and define it. And it is simply a better practice to simply provide clear limits, certain things like number of bedrooms. And so we are going, again, 3. We have looked at some sample floor plans, and you can clearly fit 3 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms and 1,200 square feet. And it seems fairly generous for an accessory unit.
And we are stipulating just like 1 kitchen unit, right?
Correct. We limited to 1 kitchen.
Limit of 1 kitchen unit.
Correct.
Okay, so that would also limit somebody from a little bit. So, I get it. I think 3 units are it's good. It's certainly a reasonable one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Vice Chair.
Thank you. Just to, I think, clarify to saying that Commissioner Ostrowski was saying, when we talk about deed restrictions, I think we're usually talking about affordability deed restrictions. And I thought we had discussed the possibility of having those and decided not to for these. Thank you for presenting this. This seems like exactly the sort of nitpicky, detail-oriented thing that we really need to do to tidy up our code. So can you tell me if I have this right? We used to have this delayed multi-step process to allow for an iterative review on lot splits with tentative and then final maps, but ministerial approval doesn't allow for that. So having the plans presented at lot split time is a way of adapting to that reality?
Correct.
Okay. Last I'd heard, we had 1 SB9 application so far. Is it still just the 1?
I believe we have one that's still pending, but may be accepted within the next week or so.
Would that be the second one, or is that the first?
That'll be the second one. I believe that one, I think, is an urban lot split.
When you say accepted, you mean approved, or you mean just taken it?
Accepted for intake. So our permit system, you submit materials, we look at it, and we tell you if you've met the minimum requirements per our checklist, and if you're missing anything, then you need to try again.
Any further questions?
Yes. I just want to make sure about this. We're not requiring that every single family home developer design for 2 units, right?
For SB9 purposes, since the whole idea of SB9 was to actually build more housing, if you propose an SB9 project, you need to show at least 2 units on just a single lot. And if you do a urban lot split, you need to show 2 units on each lot.
Right. Can we be clear about what exactly is an SB9 project? If I buy a parcel with a house on it and I want to replace it with a new house, is that an SB9 project?
No.
Okay, that answers my question. Because I looked at the text of the ordinance and it looked like that's not the case, but the summary kind of isn't as clear about that. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure we weren't doing that.
Yeah, you specifically will need to apply for an SB9 project. There's no scenario where you kind of accidentally fall into it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So yeah, if I understand correctly, SB9 usually involves some kind of a splitting of the lot. If you don't split the lot, then it's
no, there's 2 scenarios with SB9. So SB9 has effectively 2 parts. You have the being able to build two primary units on an existing lot, plus your ADU, plus the JADU on the existing lot. And you can also separately from that do an urban lot split. So if you do an urban lot split, you're limited to 2 units on each lot, inclusive of primary units, JADUs, and ADUs. So in either scenario, that one piece of property will get you 4 units.
Got it. Going back to the deed restrictions, easements are a type of deed restriction. For example, you have easements in front of your property for the utilities. And the easement says, even though this is your land, it's reserved for utilities. You cannot build anything in the front 5 foot, 10 foot, or whatever that easement width happens to be, correct?
It's a different type of encumbrance.
Okay, but it's a type of deed restriction. So
Not as we use that term. So when the city uses the term deed restriction, generally, at least with regard to ADUs and SB9, we're talking about an owner occupancy restriction with regard to JAD. So you have to live there. If you didn't live in the property, you'd be violating the city's law, or the prohibition against Airbnb, short-term rentals. If you did that, you would be violating the city's municipal code. The restriction, again, the deed restriction on the title of the property is really very much intended to be a disclosure to new owners. So when you buy that property, you understand what the limitation is, because of course, nobody just opens up the zoning code and reads all the rules.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you clarify the ADU deed restriction element?
So the additional text that's in the draft pertains to JADUs. So per state law, a property with a JADU needs to have an owner occupancy requirement. So that means the owner either needs to live in the main house or within the JADU.
And then does it apply to ADUs?
No.
Does it apply to the situation where there are 3 units built on the property that you just outlined?
I'm sorry, with regard to if you had a house, an ADU, and a JADU?
Yeah, or you said 2 houses and 2 ADUs, let's say.
So if you had just an existing piece of property and you wanted to do an SB9 and you want to do 2 primary homes, an ADU, and a JADU, yes, you would need to live on the property in either one of your 2 primary houses or within the JADU.
And can you clarify the purpose of that deed restriction for the JADU?
It's a state mandate, the owner occupancy restriction. So the city's requirement for the deed restriction is just to disclose that to new buyers. So that when you sell that property, that homeowner knows that that property cannot be a 100% investment property. They have to live there.
Right, but what is the intent of the law?
I can't speak to the intent of the California State Legislature. I've given up on that.
I'm just trying to understand. It applies to JADUs, but not to other means of creating more housing stock. And it seems like the JADU is the simplest and most straightforward way to create additional housing stock.
And interestingly, there used to be a provision in state law that allowed for an owner occupancy requirement for anyone constructing an ADU. And that was removed from the law. at the same time that they were adding the requirement for the JADU. So all of us, I think, who have been trying to parse all this out are scratching our heads to some extent.
Yeah, you have to remember that all this housing legislation comes from different legislators. They don't necessarily talk with each other. A lot of these bills actually conflict with each other and they need to be reconciled. This is being done in a very haphazard manner, unfortunately.
Well, and I think it helps just to clarify that you don't understand it. I'm not missing it. Off the record.
Okay. So I'm sorry, let me just ask one more question. It's what we've all been talking about, maybe in a different way, and not to belabor the point here, but, and I know that we only have one or two SB9s so far. But I guess, so as everybody kind of tries to envision how this is going to play out, do you expect that a large number of single-family property owners that do want to significantly remodel their home or build a new home on their lot, do you think that there will be a significant number of them that will, while they're doing that, might as well split the lot SB9 style and be ready for another unit, another home, or another something down the road? Or do you think that that's still going to be a unusual, seldom used?
I mean, my personal opinion is that, I mean, subdividing a property and building multiple units, that's a challenging thing for professionals, let alone lay people.
Well, they're going to hold off. They're not going to build right away. That's what we're talking about.
But you would still need to plan for it.
And
So
it's
you
the
still need
expense,
like an
okay, the
architect and
expense of,
engineer.
okay. all right.
And you're basically like taking your lot and only building your house on one side of it. So like, and it's not like you can reserve 30%. You have to reserve 40%.
So shall we
So it's
preserve
not
this for
very
the
practical.
discussion? Finish off the questions.
Okay, no, that's interesting though. It's good to figure this out. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, and then in terms of, I think I saw a note regarding balconies and decks not allowed.
Yes, I believe we have some design standards regarding privacy. Let's see.
Like for example, so we talk a lot about in some of the non-residential zoning areas, kind of maximizing usable space with regards to rooftop decks and that kind of thing. And I've seen some housing built in Campbell where there's been a deck over the garage, for example, which I think is a good idea when we're trying to be a little bit more efficient in terms of our space, and that doesn't impact privacy because it's towards the front. So would that type of deck be prohibited based on?
Currently, as you can see on the screen, balconies and decks, yes, that would be prohibited. So the tax would prohibit rooftop terraces and decks. So a deck on top of a garage would be reasonably captured in that prohibition. And then balconies would only be allowed in the front elevation. And this is a little more lax than the current text from our interim ordinance that we're currently working from that actually does not allow any balconies or decks whatsoever.
But is that true across Campbell or just for the Santa Moss and Campbell Village?
So in the Santa Moss and Campbell Village areas where we exercise some level of discretionary design review, if there's a privacy issue, we can try to address that. I mean, I know it's not technically an objective standard, but we can still impose requirements so long as they don't render a project infeasible. And limiting the sight lines or requiring additional privacy walls, I mean, that can minimize privacy impact. So we have some tools still on that end. But outside of those two areas, you are correct. We have absolutely zero requirements whatsoever when it comes to rooftop decks or balconies. You can really do whatever. Now, the reason here is that we're dealing in a new universe where the existing 6,000 square foot plus lot is now smaller or is more tightly packed with units that are often now closer to your neighbor. Whereas right now, you need to step back your second story so that you kind of give your neighbor some privacy. And that also has the tendency to maybe minimize the impact of your balcony in terms of privacy. But here we are dealing with 4-foot setbacks, like all the way up. So there's just a greater degree of potential privacy impact because, of course, these things are just now closer to property lines and to other buildings. And since this is all ministerial, we have no tools to then address potential privacy issues.
And the 4-foot setback is across the board, new housing
Side and rear property lines per SB 9
and the second story.
and second story.
Okay, even for one unit on a non-split lot. So non-SB 9 is what I'm asking.
So non-SB 9, no. So non-SB 9, you still need to adhere to your half the wall height kind of setback requirement that effectively steps buildings back. So generally, with a R16 property, your ground floor is at a 5-foot setback, and your second floor, depending on your ceiling height, is at about an 8 to 10-foot setback.
Yeah.
Have
So
a
the
wedding
concern
cake
is
style.
if someone wants to like build a new house and put a JADU in it, that would be considered SB 9 and they would have the minimal setback.
No, so on a non-urban lot split scenario, they actually need to build 2 primary units.
To qualify, I think this gets back to the question that was asked earlier in terms of how was one define SB 9?
So we actually have a definition of SB 9 in the draft ordinance. And again, this is us trying to, the law is fairly short, so we're trying to add a little more clarity to it. Because surprisingly, a lot of the state's legislation is not particularly objective. It's the world we're living in now, unfortunately. So to try to address that, we did outline the best we could the several scenarios that constitute an SB 9 project. And that's listed under the definition of proposed housing development, which is the terminology the SB 9 law uses. So it talks about construction of 2 primary units, or if you have one existing primary unit and you build a new one, so you retain it. And then there's scenarios where you get into the urban lot splits, or and there's actually a handful of properties already have 2 primary homes on them. So now suddenly those could be an SB 9 project. Currently, those properties, one of the homes is considered non-conforming, so it's basically just locked in place. It can't get any larger. So potentially that could change. So there are 6 different scenarios of what would constitute an SB 9 project, as far as we understand it.
Okay, and then was there a refinement of the definition of how a lot could be split since the last time we discussed this?
No, you're referring to this remains unchanged with regard to the type of lots that are allowed. So we're talking about creation of regular lots. Again, SB 9 is very clear that the city can create objective subdivision standards, and this is fairly objective in terms of just basic geometry, what type of lots are allowed, and anything that's not defined would be an irregular lot and therefore prohibited. And what we're trying to avoid is just crazy lots that just zigzag around, and we have arguments about, well, what's the side? What's the front? What's the rear? Is there 2 sides? Are there 4 sides? What about at intersections? And how do the setback planes start to relate to each other? It can get very complicated with irregular lots. So having some level of just very clear shapes that we can work from. And then these illustrations also identify what is the yard, your front yard, your side yard, your street side yard, as it relates to setbacks as well. So we get to get 2 birds with 1 stone with these diagrams. Again, it all needs to be objective. So
Yeah, thanks for this clarification. I know when we were working on some of the elements in the Campbell Village plan, because of some of the uniqueness and potentially some unintended consequences of properties on corners and cul-de-sacs that have limitations with regards to where things are placed on the property or what the setbacks can be and things like that. the decision was made that if there were those situations that the community development director could basically make a conclusion because the decisions could not be objectively outlined for each of those situations. So is that part of this? I think it's true what you said that, yeah, there's discussions about what's the side and what's the rear, and there's quite a bit of subjectivity. And that was the reason for making a kind of special case for those oddly shaped lots.
If I recall, the Campbell Village plan does have some flexibility as it pertains to side setbacks, maybe street side setbacks. But that's an example of what cannot happen in the future. I mean, the future is really about rigid rules, objective standards, getting rid of our discretion, your discretion.
Yeah, so that means that we're applying some overly undue burden to those uniquely shaped lots that wouldn't be able to take advantage of building more housing stock based on the fact that there is no way to clearly outline it objectively. And so the application that's applied here is really for rectangular lots.
Not necessarily. I mean, some properties, I mean, this is actually why we added the pie-shaped lot. That's not currently in our interim ordinance, so that does provide more flexibility. But yes, I mean, the idea of objective standards does mean to some degree there will be some properties that cannot be subdivided. Otherwise, I mean, creating rules means sometimes you're not going to be able to comply with them, and you won't be able to then be able to exercise the SB 9 law.
So what is the situation described for the pie-shaped lot that you're talking about?
Well, there you're looking at, I mean, imagine that that new lot is not there. So you're looking at just kind of a weird crescent shaped lot, I guess, currently. And so by doing that, you basically create a, well, in this case, maybe it's just two pie-shaped lots, whereas before you would have just, well, currently we would now call under this ordinance an irregular lot. By creating a pie-shaped lot, you now have two pie-shaped lots that are regular lots, which means that's okay. I mean, but yes, there are some properties that are going to be very challenging, if not impossible, to satisfy the requirements that are outlined here. That is absolutely true.
If I could, I don't want to make this more complicated, but whether or not someone could actually seek a variance is subject still to further interpretation and exploration in the future. That issue has not been decided by any court, by any government body. So it remains a possibility, but it's not the direction that the state essentially is looking for cities to go.
And if I can just also add, I mean, if you look at the map of the city, most of the city is fairly generally rectangular lots. That's not the case in all cities, but given our flat topography and the era which the city was mostly subdivided, this generally applies to most lots. Not all, but most.
Yeah, I think that's my point, and that's why the exception was made in the other plans. And quite a bit of people spoke up about that situation.
So I guess this is verging between opinion and questions now. So given that we spent an hour on questions, I'd suggest that we move on unless anybody's got particularly strong questions.
Back to the balconies. You said there was an exception for front elevation on balconies.
Yes.
So that brings to mind, I know it's not common out here, but it is common in other places, including a lot in the east, and it could become a new design, is that you could do a upstairs, downstairs duplex that looks like a regular house, but there's an internal staircase where you go upstairs to the second level. My grandparents had one in Buffalo. And that would fit into a subdivision quite nicely. And they typically had a front porch on the lower level and a balcony on the upper level. Would our code allow for something like that?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure where we put it at the moment, but we did allow for units, for duplex units to actually be side to side, back to front, or on top of each other. So we did capture that development potential, and that would also allow you to have the stairway and balconies, but in the front, again, the front elevation.
That's what I'm asking.
That's fine. You can certainly have, per the design text, the front of the primary dwelling unit. So even if you had two units stacked upon each other, both could have balconies facing forward. They just couldn't have balconies facing to the sides or backwards.
Okay.
And now again, though, with the design review standards, I mean, this is entirely voluntary stuff. I mean, this is just kind of staff recommendation based off some best practices and trying to limit privacy impacts and design impacts to the community. But I mean, quite frankly, it's entirely optional. Nothing says we have to regulate design.
Okay, I guess that wasn't clear. So sometimes we refer to guidelines as things you have to do, and other times things you don't have to do.
And these are design review standards.
And standards are some things that you have to do, and sometimes you don't have to do them.
Those standards are requirements now.
I think what,
Can you clarify that?
Yeah, I think what-
Because I think that's a little bit offensive.
I didn't realize I did that, but
Let's keep it professional, please.
He was gonna do that.
no, I was just going to say, to clarify what Daniel was saying, if you leave these standards in the ordinance, they will be mandatory, but we're not required to have those standards in the ordinance, I think is what
Yes,
Daniel
yes,
was saying.
yes.
You could remove those if you don't want them in there.
Correct. If you feel that prohibiting balconies in the manner that's being proposed is overly burdensome, you could recommend to the council that you just not have that requirement. And then
Well,
you,
thank you for that.
apologies.
Thank you for that clarification. I think that was, so it's not required by law,
Correct.
but it's here,
Yes,
which we can discuss.
yes.
Okay.
Any further questions?
And before you engage in your discussion, just bear in mind too that this law is evolving. I've already read in the newspaper about some legislators looking at updating SB 9 already. So I think inevitably we're going to get another bite of the apple. So, and that's just going to be the nature of it, I'm afraid. So if we don't get it perfect, we'll be able to return to it at some point next year if necessary.
Thank you. So I'll open the public hearing. Do we see anybody online? I'll close that and open it for discussion.
Well, first I want to say thank you for all the clarification. I think one of the reasons why there are so many questions is because it is confusing. It's not clear. You know, you all are trying to interpret the legislature and we're trying to interpret your interpretation of the legislature. So, you know, I think we want to do the right thing by the city. And again, as was mentioned earlier, there's some things in here that we missed before, and we're trying to do our due diligence to make sure that we're evaluating all this thoroughly with the goal of increasing the housing stock for the community, making it, you know, not making it an undue burden on the folks that want to do that, but at the same time, taking into account what's best for the community, which is why we're all here. So thank you for your patience.
Okay. Well, Commissioner Ostrowski, do you want to lead with comments on the?
I'll take a pause. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Rivlin.
I'm not prepared for any comments yet.
I'm sorry. Could you say that again, please? I missed it.
You know, I said I'm not prepared for any comments just yet.
Okay. Commissioner Zis.
No, I just second Commissioner Ostrowski's comments and appreciate the effort put into this and that we were able to clarify things that I wasn't clear on. So I'm good. Thank you.
You know, this is a continual learning process, and that was a good clarification. I think that the staff has done a pretty good job of trying to interpret the state law and getting Campbell in good shape for the new law. So I'm okay with the staff recommendation as it is. The balconies is something that we might want to discuss, though. I didn't think a lot about that particular point or any of the particular individual points, but I think what we have is a pretty good, pretty good attempt to clarify this thing. That's going to be an ongoing evolution, I think. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So the feedback I want to give is, in my job, I help people with SB9 projects. That's one of the things I do. So I deal with many different cities, SB9 ordinances. I don't do them in Campbell because of, being a commissioner here, but in all the other cities, and the feedback is, I think Campbell's doing a fantastic job compared to some of the other cities, because you could see it in the ordinance, like, how can we stop this SB9? How can we put some kind of an ordinance into place to make it where people can't be successful, unfortunately, and I don't see that in Campbell. I see it as, here's the law, they want us to do this, we need to increase housing, and this is how we want to do it. So thank you to staff, and Bill. Now, regarding the balconies that we were talking about, that is of interest to me as well, and I would like to be able to discuss that. And because there are instances where your home may be facing somebody else's driveway or a highway. There's no the back of your home, and there's no privacy issue there. So why can't you have a balcony? So we gotta make sure that we address the issue, and if privacy is the issue, then we go with that rather than a cookie cutter, solution for all these different situations that we may have. As far as the one thing that I'm not clear for our SB9 regulations is, if you do want to build two main units in one of the parcels, let's say you got parcel 1 and 2, you got unit A and B. If they both want to be main units, what is the maximum square footage that we allow for that type of situation?
So you are still limited by the maximum FAR of the zoning district, but the city has to still allow at least 800 square feet, regardless of the maximum FAR. So it depends on the size of the lot.
Of course, I mean, if ADUs are 1,200 square feet, I don't think main units would be, I don't think anybody will go for would call it a main unit if it's going to be less than 1,200 square feet. I was on the impression that main units can.
So for instance, if you have a 6,000 square foot lot,
Okay.
a 45% FAR gives you 2,700 square feet of building area.
I see.
And so presumably under SB9, then you choose not to build a garage, which would count otherwise against your FAR. So you're just going to have uncovered parking. So 2,700 square feet divided by 2 gets you 1,350 square feet.
I see.
So each unit would be 1,350.
Okay. Now, I was on the impression that residential zoning don't have an FAR, or was it PD zoning that don't have FAR?
Yeah, I think you're thinking of the last meeting with the associate planner, Tracy Tam, as she provided some back history in terms of our FAR requirement only being introduced in 2004. Prior to that, we did not.
Okay, but the PD zoning, you have to come to some kind of an agreement on that FAR, right? Or
SB9 does not apply to PD zoned properties. SB9 will only apply to R1 zoned properties.
I see.
So yes.
Okay, that was a surprise. I thought if PDs are residential, then SB9 would apply to them.
No, the terminology that is the case with ADUs. So we have to allow ADUs on PD zone properties. In those circumstances, though, we draw a comparison to the most comparable zoning district based on the general plan, since our general plan has mostly a one-to-one relationship between land use district and zoning district. So we tie you back to your comparable zoning district, but none of that applies to SB 9.
Please, Vice Chair.
I'd like to second what Commissioner Camper said about thanks to staff for doing the right thing and not trying to fight the law. I think we see this in the housing element work that we've done here, as well as this, that there are some places in this, some cities are trying to drag their heels or somehow get out of following state law, which we're really not trying to do here. And I do not want to take that for granted. One of the things that's really striking me is that we at this point have had two applications, one application and one soon to be application for SB 9 use. We're putting a lot of effort into this and it may wind up being used very little, if at all. And so I'm a bit curious as to why. I wonder to what extent, for example, is the owner occupancy affidavit, is that mandated by the state or is that just allowed by the state and everybody's doing that?
The requirement for the subdivider to indicate that the intent to occupy is per state law.
Okay.
The requirement for an affidavit, that is coming from staff.
Okay, so it could.
It's just a document that says I, subdivider, will plan to live on lot 1 for a period of 3 years. And then we record that on the property and we've checked the box per state law.
Per state law, they could just say that, have a handshake, and that would.
And pinky swear, yeah.
Yeah. That's an odd way of arranging that, and I can see why this is somewhat frustrating. The only thing that struck me here, I think this is a lot of really good detailed work. I very, very much appreciate that we are fixing some of the places in which our ADU code is non-compliant with the state law. The only thing I would add, and I realize this wasn't in the original, but Commissioner Ostrowski inspired me. I wonder if we could allow roof decks on ADUs as long as, for example, they're only street facing and don't have exposure to side or rear setbacks, for example.
I mean, we're not touching the existing privacy requirements for ADUs with this particular draft ordinance. Are you referring to SB 9 projects, or are you actually just more broadly speaking?
The bit here where it says rooftop terraces and decks are prohibited. What does that apply to?
This speaks to SB 9 projects, so primary dwelling units.
Okay, so yes, that.
Yes, I mean, you could just strike that language or modify it as you see fit.
In that case, it would allow people on SB 9s to have a balcony, but in other applications, it wouldn't, because that's the current wording for all developments.
No, this is the draft text that pertains to SB 9 projects.
Okay.
What is the rule for balconies and roof decks for current R1 projects?
So in the San Tomas area, there isn't anything hard and fast. You have subjective privacy language that encourages certain things and discourages other things, subjective. In Campbell Village, there's also confusing and subjective language as it pertains to balconies and decks, nothing that's particularly objective. And then outside of those two areas, there are no rules whatsoever.
Okay, so if we struck the rule about balconies and roof decks, that would mean that SB 9 projects had the same flexibility as existing projects did. But the concern with that is that because these projects are going to be closer together, 4-foot setbacks and so forth, that might be a poor idea. So if we were to I would propose modifying that to say that rooftop terraces and decks are only allowed if they have, for example, front exposure, much like balconies are only allowed on the front elevation.
I mean, a rooftop terrace is the whole roof, right?
And I suppose
So
you'd have to put up
what's-
some kind of wall or screen or something to make that work, and that seems a little bit off.
Yeah, this is the challenge with objective standards. You're kind of almost compelled to start pre-designing a lot of facets of a house.
Sorry, to interrupt. But if that was struck, would the privacy restrictions still apply?
Well,
So
if
if it
this was
was-
removed, then there would be no limitation on balconies or terraces or decks.
So if it was a privacy issue to a neighbour, they'd have no recourse.
Correct.
Which is pretty much the case in most.
Can there be ministerial review? Could that be the language we put in here?
So the concept of ministerial review is that the reviewer does not exercise any discretion or personal analysis. You're literally just looking, does it meet the code? Yes or no? And if there's no standard, then the answer is yes, and then it's non-material.
Yeah, I would add that it may not be worth putting this much effort into, because as I understand it, since I did not know, but you can put a roof deck on pretty much any house in the city, and I think very, very few of them have roof decks. So this may not be worth really looking into.
I'd just like to pick up on a good point Commissioner Ostrowski just said. So if I get it right, there's no restriction on other developments having a roof deck.
That's why there's quite a nice one that's above a garage somewhere in Campbell that was built in the last few years. And I think that, you know, in terms of use of property and like community feel, I agree, you know, there's a privacy element, but if it's facing the front, it's like a nice way to get outdoor living space.
We could add, talk about having some kind of setback from the property line, because the concern is like you can build these on buildings now, we don't want people to build these when they're 4 feet apart and you can, lay a ladder across between people's roof decks, because that would be awkward.
To me, that's an excellent compromise where you get to have it, but not so close to the neighbor. So if your unit is 4 feet away, first of all, that 4 foot setback is minimum. We can always have more. But let's say your unit is 4 foot from the property line. Your roof deck, however, has to be farther out.
So, sorry, SB 9, we cannot require setback greater than 4 feet.
Right? People can
Right.
build a larger setback.
But they can propose 5 feet.
Correct.
They don't have to be at 4 feet.
No.
Yes?
That is correct. They
Okay.
could do more
Right.
voluntarily.
All right. So that 4 foot is minimum, but let's say they use that 4 foot minimum. The roof deck, however, has to be a little bit more. 5 foot, 6 foot, 10 foot, whatever, you're designing the house to begin with, so you design it so that the edge of the roof deck is, let's say, 10 foot from the property line. This way you have a normal roof deck,
That's a good idea.
I think that sounds like a good idea. I would definitely be in favor of that. Because it kind of takes the status quo and tries to adapt it to a new type of development in a way that makes sense.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good idea.
Can I ask a question? So what's the difference between a deck and a balcony? In this,
I mean, generally, a deck would be on the roof of a building.
oh, I see
So
what
like
you're saying.
the Commissioner
So
Ostrowski indicated, like a
terrace
deck
or
above a
roof deck,
garage.
terrace or deck, okay.
Whereas a balcony basically takes two forms. It either projects out or it's inset.
But we're allowing balconies on front elevation of units. So if you build and split, if you split and put, one in the front and one in the back, one in the back could have a front facing balcony. Is that correct? As well as the one in the front?
That is true. So in a flag lot situation where you have one lot functionally behind the other, that is true. But the front property line still has a 20-foot setback. So you're not at a 4-foot setback. So you're still pretty far away from the neighbor in front of you.
It seems to me that allowing balconies in a front elevation here as an exception is the rooftop terrace thing is a different issue, but I think there's there's a privacy issue there. I don't have any problems with that. So, but this, in terms of balconies on the front, it seems that's a,
I mean-
that solves part of the problem. And we're not really talking about restricting people to put in extra units simply because we're refusing to do rooftop terraces. It's just, I think it's a reasonable privacy issue.
I mean, if I could just, one compromise could be allowing rooftop terraces and decks only on the first story. So like the garage example. And so not allowing somebody to have a second story rooftop deck. So your deck area would be 10 feet off the ground as opposed to 20 feet off the ground.
That sounds reasonable.
And then the other issue is the so-called surprise factor, where you have your house, the neighbors builds, and then they put the balcony on. You had no notice there's going to be that privacy issue. But if you're building 2 homes from scratch, and let's say you're going to sell one, whoever buys it already sees the privacy issue and already sees, and if it's acceptable to them, they follow through with the purchase. If it's not, they won't, so there's no surprise, if you will. There's no element of one homeowner feeling the neighbor is sort of,
Yeah, I guess my thinking is that having balconies and decks at the rear, because this is going to be higher density. So if you could have 2 single developments and you put a duplex in there, they're going to be dense, right? So that could be a potential shock to the neighbours anyway. And then you put effectively 2, 4. If you do balconies and decks, additional areas, the privacy of the neighbours.
But you could do
I
this
would say is going to be an issue.
But you could do this in most of Cambo already. Only in San Tomas area, there's this restriction. The rest of the Cambo, you could actually do this right now.
That's for only single family homes.
That's single family homes, not double density, not duplex on the same plot.
I mean, the other thing we're saying is that you can basically, if you're going to build it like a ADU, you can build a stairwell on the side of your property, which can be 4 feet from the fence. And in other words, like that's somebody walking up to get into their unit on the side of the property. And it's a little bit similar to what we're talking about here, except it's a little bit less functional. But there is kind of inevitably going to be that situation of less privacy, which in a way is some compromise that has to be made in order to build more units. I don't know what the right answer is, but it's a condition that already exists based on what's allowed in the draft.
If I can throw out an idea, maybe this should be balconies are allowed, but only when facing the street. Roof decks are prohibited in San Tomas and Campbell Village, else allowed with a larger setback. I'm willing to be persuaded either larger setback or only on the first floor. Like either of those seem like reasonable ways of doing this, especially if we want to have this principle of least surprise, and we don't want balconies to be, right up abutting other houses. Having them, only facing the street seems reasonable.
What is going to happen with the non-objective standards in these other area plans?
Well, I mean, we are currently in process of signing a contract with a consultant that will be working with us to create objective standards. And that will be a big policy question for the commission and council of to what extent we translate existing subjective language into objective standards. That's a big outstanding question that still needs an answer.
So putting this balcony issue to one side, we can come back and visit in a second. Are there other issues we have with the proposal here? Any other comments? We can come back to this balcony thing, but I'm just trying to round out any issues that we have apart from this.
I thought the objective review standards were pretty flexible, and I didn't see anything in there that was a big limitation.
Okay. So
I
what
think
I'm,
the only thing that is excluded is flat roofs. The slope has to be between 412 and 812. I know we did spend some time talking about whether or not we wanted to allow flat roofs,
I thought
like on
that-
an ADU, for example.
Well, again, this is pertaining, the language here is regarding primary units under SB 9. But yes, I mean, again, you're correct. I mean, that much of the city is not under any design standards whatsoever. For simplicity, this is as structured as citywide. We did not try to carve it up by area plan. That's certainly, I guess, an option, but not one that, quite frankly, we have time for. We do need to get this to the council at their August 2nd meeting so that it can be adopted ahead of the expiration of the interim ordinance, and the council could extend that. But yes, I mean, particularly with the design aspect of this is very much kind of policy questions, and there is no right answer. That's what makes it very challenging, because it's very community specific.
In terms of carving out for particular neighborhoods, I'm not that favor about that. Not only that, it's been my impression that when we go to objective standards, the neighborhood standards will be somewhat obsolescent. A lot of that will go away in terms of being able to use subjective standards in San Tomas or Campbell Village. Am I right on that?
Yes, I mean, but I guess what I was referring to earlier is that if there's if the spirit of privacy concerns, that can be translated into objective standards if that's what the council so desires. So for instance, here we're talking about privacy impacts having to do with balconies. And maybe in some areas where we don't currently have those types of requirements, and our future objective standards will simply have no limitation on that, because we've never had a limitation on it. But maybe it may be appropriate to impose limitations in Santa Tomas, since we've historically dealt with privacy impacts. I mean, you can find ways to make subjective standards actionable on an objective basis. It's hard, but it's possible.
so I'm hearing just at the moment, the balcony thing is the thing we want to close out on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with you that we all concluded that we did not want to have area by area standards. So I think the concern I have is that if we don't allow, and if you just Google, flat roof homes, there are a lot of really nice modern designs. A lot of people are leaning towards some of those modern designs that allow for bigger windows and more light, and depending on the direction that things face, some quite a number of energy efficiency elements. So that to me is one of the limitations here that we should consider.
Okay, so what would it
That's on
take
page
for?
4.
So there's a limitation, is it L roof forms?
Roof forms, yeah.
I would support, flat roofs. I think from a social point of view, there's a lot of pluses that it brings to neighborhoods when you are on your deck, and whatever activity you're doing, it puts you in touch with your neighbors. You have an eye on the street. There's a lot of pluses, I think, that flat roofs brings.
So what was the reason for specifying that particular roof? Why do we have to specify that roof? Can't we just keep it open?
I'm sorry?
What was the reason for specifying, well, in this case, non-flat roofs?
I mean, the general thrust of this is just trying to encourage more traditional building forms, for greater neighborhood compatibility. I mean, Campbell doesn't have a lot of very hyper modern or contemporary homes as a general practice, as opposed to some communities. I mean, most new homes are still fairly on the traditional side. And that's what this more or less generally reflects. I mean, that is a value judgment.
Okay, so this is aesthetic,
Yes.
effectively just,
Correct.
okay.
To what extent is that because most of our homes are pretty old?
Well, I'm saying even new homes are generally on the traditional side,
Okay.
kind of a Campbell aesthetic.
But just to be clear, this, like the roof forms, this is a difference from the current R1 standards. We don't require people not to do flat roofs or anything like that.
That is correct.
Okay, yeah, I would be in favor of not adding restrictions to SB9 projects that aren't on R1 projects without like a really good specific reason.
Okay.
And I understand that we don't have anything between all roof types are allowed, certain roof types are prohibited. We can't really encourage anything.
Okay, so just for clarification, I mean, so that would basically eliminate pretty much any restriction on balconies, colors, columns, finished floor height, the entryway, doors, porches, step backs, garage, well, yeah, garage is garage, or plate heights, roof forms, roof materials. You would be removing most of the design section.
So, for example, like balconies and roof decks, there's a reason to have something different there because the buildings are going to be closer together.
Correct.
Like that I can understand, but the roof should be pointier doesn't really have anything to do with them being close together. as
Now, I would
understand
also point out though, because this does apply citywide, we were also thinking of Santa Moss and Campbell Village, which are probably, 40% of the city's residential housing area, where you do have more traditional design guidance. I mean, it's not objective, but there clearly is an intent there to encourage more traditional home designs, such as, Craftsman, as opposed to just, a white box it looks like an Apple store.
I can totally understand. Well, if we really don't want to have different standards for San Tomas versus the rest of the city, that kind of means that either San Tomas is going to have the standards that we have in the rest of the city, or we're going to have the standards that San Tomas has. And I'd prefer that the whole city not be forced to follow an objective version of San Tomas's standards. I would prefer that, San Tomas be allowed to keep their, have an objective version of their standards and so forth, as long as it doesn't prevent them from building SB9 units. That's just me.
Yeah, so I'm a little unclear on how the process is going to work between citywide and then hiring the consultant to create objective standards for the 2 area plan regions. If here we're saying, well, we tried to take into account something that could apply citywide. And sort of, it looks kind of like an average of no restrictions in the city and some of the guidelines in the other 2 area plans.
Sure. And again, I mean, that's going to be a much broader discussion that'll come forward separately. Unfortunately, that's really something that's being handled by Stephen and the directors. I'm afraid I'm not super familiar with it, but the kickoff is actually, I believe, starting tomorrow with our consultant. So we're getting the ball rolling on that side, but again, separate issue.
Okay.
So there's 2 things, the balcony and this roof, but you mentioned, Daniel, that if we removed the roof restriction, it would take out all the other design restrictions?
No. I was just referring to Commissioner Buckbinder's comment that that the ordinance shouldn't have any standards that do not currently apply to R1 properties outside of Santa Moss, which are none. So pretty much all these standards would be new design standards that currently do not apply to non-Santa Moss, non-Campbell Village properties.
Can I just throw in that specifically, I said we shouldn't add design standards that don't have something to do with managing density and so that don't have a specific justification based on why these projects are different.
Yeah, and that can be, a little challenging to parse. For instance, let's see here. Like so for K, plate height. Plate height is basically your ground to ceiling height. So we're telling about the kind of the height, the relative height of stories. we're trying to minimize building massing. I mean, a big part of what at least planning is historically about is about good design, and that has to do with not just the aesthetic, but just bulk and how large homes look and whether or not that's appropriate for a neighborhood. And so, for instance, here we're looking at 12 feet, which is fairly generous. It's usually taller than most would normally do, but these properties are more densely built, maybe taller buildings, taller plate heights would be seen as a kind of an adverse thing from a neighborhood compatibility perspective. But again, these are value judgments. Same thing with privacy. Privacy is a value judgment.
No,
I mean, there's not a clear answer to all this. I mean, if the commission believes that the imperative here is housing and that any impact to the neighborhood is immaterial, then we don't need design standards whatsoever. If you want to strike a balance, then that's a much longer discussion.
well, the way I see it though is probably 90% of the development, maybe 95% will use the normal plate height of 10 feet, and so there might be one or two that may, there's no standard, I'm just going to go 15 feet, but that's going to be far and few in between. There's not going to be predominant, majority of the development. So we may be worried about the exception and just, making the rest of the developers and,
I think the issue is that if we go revisit every item here, we're basically redesigning this whole proposal.
I think that's our job.
Well, how long do you want to spend doing that, right?
It's only 9 o'clock. We have lots of other meetings.
Well, one item with many parts in it.
Yeah, I guess I will say I'm getting a little uneasy, although we're talking about some great issues. And I guess we were all wondering, every city in the state was kind of wondering how the SB 9 is going to change everything. And I think in Campbell, one thing that certainly came to my mind, and I know others right away when this came about, is this going to completely gut the San Tomas plan and the Campbell Village plan? And I think maybe we thought, yeah, probably will, but I don't know if this meeting right now, is this the time we want to do that, or when do we want to do, I don't exactly know when we want to do that or when the proper time is to do that, but it does seem like a fairly major change. So,
Yeah, so I guess.
I'm a little bit, I don't know if we want to go that far. I do think that the idea on the balconies, I would go with Commissioner Bookbinder's second suggestion about, and Daniel mentioned the first story. On the first story, I think that's fine. I think things are going to change. We are going to get modern. We're going to have a lot more flat roofs eventually. And but that big, broad-based question, that big issue, I'm not sure if we're ready for that right now. It would be perhaps a long, major kind of discussion, but maybe I'm putting too much into it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think there's some really good points here. It can be a very long evening if we go through point by point. I'm not saying it isn't valid, right, the comments here. I'd support your view on the flat roof and the balcony. I wouldn't be in favour of visiting everything and I'd ask for a show of hands in which way we want to go before we do that.
Well, I think there's a few options, right? One is making adjustments to those 2 points. The other one is what you don't want to do, which is revisiting every point by point. The third option is basically eliminating the additional restrictions that are in this document that are outside of what the rest of Campbell, except for the area plans require. So we're talking about like a page of standards that are more restrictive than what Campbell has. And so the question is, do we want to include them now if we don't want to go through them point by point, or do we want to leave those out so that and go through some version of that when the consultant goes through the 2 area plans.
How do people feel about it? This is a proposal from Commissioner Ostrowski here. I guess we've got three options. We can go with it as is, with modifications on the roof, balcony. We can go through it item by item, or your third point is not to include, or at least review the restrictions which are coming from the St. Thomas area. How do people feel about that?
Well, I think we're going beyond the scope of, I mean, we had actually approved this previously. And actually, it was one of the people that brought up the idea of having more flexibility in future design of houses, including flat roofs. But it seems to me we're beyond the scope today in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here. And I'm uncomfortable with sorting it out, all this design stuff here, without getting staff recommendations, you know, and a serious review of it at another time. I would rather approve what we have, especially since we had already approved all this before, and then have staff, you know, understand that we're interested in, as part of a bigger program, to revisit, to me, the appropriate time is when we do the objective standards thing and look at it as a bigger picture for future development. But so that's my position on it.
You know, if I could just add, I mean, I suspect too that once we actually do adopt a good program of objective standards, that probably will supplant a lot of this.
Commissioner,
But these design review standards are new. We did not approve section 21-25-070 previously, right?
Yeah. No, at your last meeting, you did recommend this as currently written.
I guess we
I
didn't
think you're
go into as much detail.
No, I'm mostly in line with, I think, what we're trending towards. I've thought about staff. I've read staff's comments or adjustments. I think they're reasonable. And then perhaps we add a small clause in our motion that says roof decks with certain restrictions that Vice Chair represented. And then I would want to revisit these if it's fellow commissioners' interest as part of objective standards for the whole city. I think maybe I'm opening Pandora's box here, but I'm thinking members of the public would also like to weigh in and have their, moment at the dais to say
that's a really good
they
point.
want certain things themselves or don't want certain things.
Yeah.
So I think by opening that review this evening would not be, it wouldn't be holistic. It would be a rushed review.
Yeah. Okay. So am I hearing we want to go with the proposal as drafted with modifications to the roof and the balcony? Or do we just want to go with as it's drafted?
Commissioner Buckbinder, what was your recommendation on that?
My recommendation was that balconies would be street facing and roof decks prohibited in San Tomas and Campbell Village, else allowed with a larger setback or only on the first floor. I think the consensus seemed to be only on the first floor.
And when you say a larger setback,
I think we proposed 10 feet.
is that?
I'm sorry, for a 10-foot setback to allow
Like the roof deck has to have a 10-foot setback. So this
so
could be
functionally the building would need to have a 10-foot setback.
it could be a stepped back second story, for example.
My interpretation is the roof deck would just need to start at 10 feet. So you could have a roof, but the actual deck or balcony itself would have to be set back to your, whatever number we arrive at.
Yeah.
Could it be violated and someone go sit further on their roof?
Well, I mean, it's
Possibly.
illegal to sit on your roof now.
Right. I mean, you could do that if you wished. It
Like
would,
what makes it a deck versus makes it a roof, for example.
I mean, the flatness of it, but yeah.
So I think this is probably illustrating the point that we're starting to design all these things on an ad hoc basis.
So you're talking about a 10-foot setback from the street?
From the property line.
in property line versus what's normal, 20?
Well, we're talking about the side property, are you talking about the
Side-
front?
side-
The side
side
property line,
setback.
SB 9 is a 4-foot setback.
But for R1, it's half the building height, right?
Correct. So it's a second story building area would typically be 8 to 10 feet at a side setback.
So that's,
But the building wall would not need to be set back is what I'm getting at. Just the space that's declared as the balcony. And
exactly.
I do agree. I don't want to design this on the fly, but that picking a number kind of locks you into that design.
Well, it's got to be objective.
Yeah, you could say equivalent to what it would be for, like the equivalent setback that you would have for an R1 parcel.
I mean, we did something comparable. Let's see if I can get this up again. So with windows, we actually did run into this issue a little bit, trying to address second story windows that would be at a 4-foot setback. So we indicated that those windows any second story windows less than 8 feet from rear side property lines would need to basically be clear story.
Right, I'm sorry.
So you have a clear story, the frosting,
Correct.
or
That they're high
the
windows.
small, narrow, high windows.
Correct. So we did try to bridge that gap. So basically it allows people to, if they want full height windows, that they have to kind of voluntarily provide a greater setback, trying to bridge the SB9 requirements for setbacks and privacy.
Okay, so basically what I'm suggesting is doing something similar to that for roof decks.
And then I would also note that, I mean, if you want to allow roof decks, you would also need to modify the roofing form because of course, you need a flat roof for a roof deck.
Yeah, and like this does run into the question of whether we're going to have separate standards for Santa Moss / Campbell Village or in the rest of the city, or whether their standards are going to be applied to the rest of the city, or the rest of the city standards are going to be applied to them.
Let's keep this simple. We're going to be going around. So on this balcony thing, why don't we come to a compromise and not do the roof deck? Because this is going to lead on to other things, but put your proposal for the balcony. Because these are going to be revisited anyway at some stage by the sound of it when we make them objective across Campbell.
It sounds like these are objective standards, though.
Yes, but when we're talking about objective standards, I mean, the city is paying a consultant a lot of money to do a much more thorough citywide job of objective standards for the whole gamut of housing project types.
Okay, so you're saying that these are temporary until we do our objective standards, which we're expecting to be doing next year?
We're going to be starting soon. Stephen is meeting with a consultant tomorrow.
And so
Okay.
does that go beyond the 2 area plans? It's for the whole city? That wasn't.
It does. Also dealing with apartment buildings, condos, mixed use buildings, all residential development types.
And when is that expected to be completed?
Not entirely sure, but probably as soon as possible. I mean, ideally it would be tied up with the general plan and housing element, but most likely given the timing as it is, it's going to slip into the spring.
Okay, so within a year is kind of what you're estimating?
Yeah, the sooner the better, because we need those standards so we can actually apply them to the new housing projects that the housing element will unlock.
Okay, great.
So
And
if
again, I
we-
imagine we'll try to reconcile this because once we do that, it doesn't really make sense to have these standards anymore.
right, so in which case, do we just want to keep the draft as proposed because it's temporary?
I'm fine with that. I'm looking at the proposed housing element, and it says that adopting the objective standards should be done by June 2023, which I think means that we really have to get them done by then.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. In that case, given that I was under the impression this is how it's going to be for the next 20 years.
No.
So yeah, I do not need to fight about this.
So do I
Can I
hear,
make a motion?
please? You read my mind.
I move to adopt the resolution referencing attachment 1, recommending that the city council adopt an ordinance to add new chapter 21.25 to new housing developments in chapter 2014 urban spot splits to the Campbell Municipal Code to implement Senate Bill number 9 and amending various sections of municipal code pertaining to the regulation of accessory dwelling units an amendment to the Campbell Village Neighborhood Plan to incorporate by reference to proposed SB9 implementation provisions and general plan amendment to the San Tomas area neighborhood plan to incorporate by reference to proposed implementation SB9 provisions.
Thank you. I hear a second.
I'll second.
Okay. Cool, please.
Commissioner Rowland.
Aye.
Commissioner Scissor.
Aye.
Commissioner Ostrowski.
Aye.
Commissioner Coyle.
Aye.
Commissioner Kankar.
Aye.
Vice Chair Bookbinder.
Aye.
Chair Chun.
Aye. So that's carried and will be recommended to the City Council the next meeting date, August the 2nd. So thank you, everybody, for that. Some really good comments.
Hopefully all that discussion will be helpful when we do our objective standards.
Yeah, so actually highlighted some really good points. Final item, Acting Development Director. Do we have a community director report?
I do not have anything to add from the director's report in your packet.
Okay, thank you. At which point, unless there's any questions for Daniel, I'll adjourn to.
Sorry.
Okay.
Did we get comments on the housing element draft?
I believe we did, and I think I overheard Stephen typing up responses.
Cool.
So he's working on it.
Just wanted to know.
So thanks, everybody, and I'll adjourn to the next meeting on the 26th of July.
Thank you.